viewers, and welcome to the 32nd lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In the previous lecture, I introduced W.H. Auden, and I gave a somewhat lengthy theoretical distinction between T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden. I ended the lecture with a brief biographical overview of the writer, and I was describing how in the first two collections that Auden published, while he was a student at Oxford, and while he was very strongly under the influence of T.S. Eliot, the kind of writing and the kind of concerns we found in that collection were very reflective of the kind of modernism we find in T.S. Eliot. That is to say, it was somewhat too cynical, too reflective, too introspective. It was simply the collection of moody thoughts by a moody poet who found himself in a very dark and depressing time. I introduced briefly how this time would be a time of transformation, and how by the end of the 1930s, Auden's concerns and Auden's style would have changed radically. The reason for that change was that in the 1920s, as a student at Oxford, Auden also began to imbibe and receive some political awakening. This had to do with the influence of Marxism, psychoanalysis, and a general anti-fascist bent of thought, which was going around in the student circles of Oxford. As a result of these intellectual influences, Auden moved away from the cynical introspection that we find in the first collection of poems published by T.S. Eliot to a somewhat different motivation for writing. For want of a better phrase, we can call this the second sort of motivation for writing. We can call it political action. It reflected an evolution of the poet's moral consciousness. I will explain this particular phrase, the evolution of the poet's moral consciousness, a little bit later. But first, let us try and understand what kind of poems did Auden publish in the 30s, and how were they different from the poems that Auden composed in the 20s. In the 30s, Auden published poems that were inspired directly by injustice, inequality, violence, and tyranny in the world that he saw around him. These poems also exhorted readers to take action. Readers were called on not just to read, introspect, and think about the world through the perspective gained from the poet's idiosyncratic use of language. A prime example of a poem like this is Spain, composed in April 1937. This poem was inspired directly by Auden's experience of taking part in and fighting, putting his life at risk in the Spanish Civil War. Briefly, in the Spanish Civil War, General Franco had taken control of the Spanish army and turned against the Republic. For the world, or at least for the English-speaking, liberal-minded, intellectually trained, culturally sophisticated part of the world, the Spanish Civil War presented the ultimate binary opposition and also the ultimate moral test of the time, of the century. The Spanish Civil War, from the perspective of General Franco, was an attempted dictatorial takeover of a constitutional and democratic government. Liberals, that is to say, supporters of democracy, or self-declared, avowed supporters of democracy from all over the world and definitely all over Europe, joined this war. They went to Spain to fight on the side of the Republicans. Uh, Writers, journalists who were famous then or who would go on to become famous later, uh, sometimes in part by writing about their participation in the Civil War, were also part of this effort. George Orwell uh, was born Eric Arthur Blair, was among those writers who participated in the war, uh, gave proof of their Marxist sympathies, that they were truly card-carrying Marxists, that they suffered for their convictions. And um, Orwell even wrote about it. The novel Keep the Aspidistra Flying is considered an important literary archive of this Spanish Civil War. So Auden's participation in this event demonstrates how central a part Auden was of the early 20th century British culture. And in particular, Auden was also a part of this early 20th century British culture, which was defined by a strong affinity with Marxism and Marxist thought. It's a tradition that exists even today. One can find this tradition quite alive in the kind of literary and cultural analysis and intellectual commentary that one gets to read in the pages of journals like the New Left Review, editorial traditions of a publisher like Verso Books, and it has had a great deal of literary and cultural influence on the intellectual life of English letters. So we can situate W.H. Auden as occupying a place at the source, or you could say this is the glacier that feeds the river of British Marxist literary thought. So this was a very important distinction between W.H. Auden and T.S. Eliot. But speaking of Auden's career, speaking of the direction that Auden's poetic career was taking, these Marxist sympathies gave a new direction to what the poet was thinking and how the poet uh, developed by publishing new poems. At the end of this decade, another major shift occurred, which would continue to uh, change and evolve the way Auden's poetry was written and read. In the year 1939, just before Second World War broke out, just before life turned upside down in Europe, Auden managed to escape Europe and move to America, seemingly for good. I say seemingly because Auden would not stay in America permanently, as he at some point planned, but he returned to Europe, uh, buying a house in Austria and creating a sort of cultural enclave, a secluded intellectual sanctuary in different parts of Europe. So this movement to America has been read by many scholars as a new beginning, the second part of Auden's career. Auden's engagement with politics continued through these two developments. The first was the consciousness of politics that originated with Auden's involvement in the Spanish Civil War. And the second, the somewhat detached and indifferent view on politics, which happened after Auden's move to America. At no point did Auden give up on politics, but Auden changed the way politics could be related to the poet's functioning as a creative and intellectual mind. What was this change? I'll try and understand and explain that here. And my source in charting this evolution in Auden's writing and thinking is Edward Mendelsohn. Edward Mendelsohn is a scholar and editor who's been editing and collecting Auden's verse for a very long time. In fact, the authoritative collections in book form today of Auden's poetry are all edited by Edward Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn's view is that of a biographer and a person with great sympathy for the figure of the poet. There are other scholars working with different professional affiliations and engagements who tend to have a different view of this evolution and growth in Auden's political and poetic development. I will have occasion to refer to those other perspectives as well. But for now, I follow Edward Mendelssohn's view, and it will give us a very useful perspective on understanding this evolution. So, for Mendelssohn, Auden's moral consciousness can be understood as evolving in two parts. Earlier, that is, before the 1930s, the poet saw human involvement in history as an unconscious one. So, whether one liked it or not, willed it or not, acted or was acted upon, a person, anyone, was a part of history. Common people, those who read and wrote, those who read and wrote poems, could at best hope for an unconscious involvement in the grand historical events of their times. Others, with real power, were in control and decided the terms of victory or defeat. It was the political leaders, the representatives of people who were consciously in control of history. Others, people like you and I, people or some like Auden who wrote poems, and others like you and I who read them, were unconsciously implicated in history. This was Auden's view of the moral implications of history for a poet before the 1930s, that is in the 20s and so on. In the 30s and later, Auden came to view the average or common person's role in history as being much more active. It was important for readers to remember that even though they were not directly involved in the fighting, they were still active participants in history. This had to do with Auden's growing awareness of his own position as a conscience keeper of the modern world. In other words, we can see that in this latter phase, Auden had consciously or unconsciously begun to take on Percy Shelley's articulation of the role of the poet in modern societies as that of the unacknowledged legislator of the world. Now that this brief biographical overview is done, I would like to give you a sense of Auden's style. What kind of a poet is Auden? I've described in theoretical and abstract terms, Auden is this, Auden is that, and here is how Auden is different from T.S. Eliot. But the defining quality of Auden's poems can only be understood by reading them. And I will speak theoretically for maybe one more minute and say that the defining quality of Auden's poetry is that it is immediately accessible. There's something in the voice which is so urgent, so immediate. It's like hearing a friend or a close person or a person we are very close to speak about an experience that is very close to them and also close to us. So there is a great deal of immediacy in Auden's writing. Auden's writing is accessible. It describes universal human experiences, and it is incredibly moving. It allows us to view ordinary experiences such as life and death and gives us an extraordinary perspective on those events, which is why the language is very memorable and moving. I will try to give a sense of that experience of reading Auden and the quality of reading Auden by reading one of his most famous elegies. This is a poem titled In Memory of W.B. Yeats. This appeared in the collection Another Time, which, as I mentioned, is among his most influential and strongest pieces of writing. Here is Auden in Auden's own words. In memory of W.B. Yeats. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted, and snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. What instruments we have agree, the day of his death was a dark, cold day. So we see that the very first sentence plunges us deep into the heart of the action. In fact, even before we read the poem, the title tells us exactly what to expect. This is a poem that is in memory of someone who is no longer alive. The title and the first stanza convey to us something of Auden's formal conservatism. Auden does not experiment with a poetic form that is known and which is proven to provide results. What is the form? The form is the elegy. And what are the results? It is a form that provides consolation. It is a form that allows people to lament something they cannot change. Nobody can bring back the dead. Yeats is dead and will no longer be alive. That fact is a source of great pain and discomfort. The poetic form allows people to reconcile themselves to this fact. When someone loses a loved one to death, they are disconsolate because they cannot go on living. The elegy is a form that allows people to reconcile themselves to irreplaceable loss. This proven poetic form, its proven result, Auden does not experiment with it. One more thing to note in this stanza is that the instruments seem to confirm what the poet feels. Right? Not only that it was a cold day, but that it was a very lonely day. The physical measurement of temperature aligns with the aligns with the emotional isolation experienced and which follows the death of a writer as beloved as William Butler Yeats. The next stanza goes, far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forests. The peasant river was untempted by the fashionable quays. By mourning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. Right? The death of the poet was kept from his poems. Right? So, by mourning tongues, people who mourned the poet, right, celebrated the poet's life through his poems. So it was as if the poet had not died because his poems were continued to be read. In fact, so many of his poems were read out and repeatedly, and so much more of his work was read in memory of the poet after he died, that it was almost as if the poems were a refusal, a denial, a sort of forgetting of the fact that the poet had died. And this last line of the second stanza, by mourning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. It has extremely suggestive meanings, and we will return to this in a discussion of the history of the elegy and how Auden complicates that history as well as gives us new ways to think about what the elegy is. Continuing the poem now. But for him, it was his last afternoon as himself, an afternoon of nurses and rumors. The provinces of his body revolted. The squares of his mind were empty. Silence invaded the suburbs. The current of his feeling failed. He became his admirers. Right? Again, the last line has a very abrupt structure, almost cryptic. He became his admirers. So there is something about the quality of admiration which is suspicious. Uh, Admirers often say things because they want to say things. So there is a sense in which admiration or flattery is always suspicious, right? But on this day, whatever people said in admiration of this poet, it was true. He became his admirers. This also has to do with the fact that the admiration of someone uh, while they're alive is different from the admiration of someone after they passed away. While they're alive, their admiration can have a sense of flattery. It can be suspected as emerging from a desire for an ulterior goal, that someone is saying good things about someone because they want something, not because they truly believe that who they are praising deserves that praise. But for someone who has passed away, that suspicion of flattery, or that suspicion that it is not genuine, not authentic, not sincere, while not completely undone, can be reduced to a great deal. This is probably what the poet means when he says he became his admirers. He would not normally do this. In fact, he would be suspicious, and in fact, we would be suspicious of admiration. But on this day, the finality of death, the irreplaceability of this loss is so strong and so unshakable that we are forced to accept that admiration is sincere. Going along, now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections, to find his happiness in another kind of wood and be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. Right? Again, the last two words containing almost uh, like a sudden twist, like a twist in the tale of a Shakespearean sonnet. Although each stanza is not a Shakespearean sonnet, but the couplet that ends each stanza contains a sharp seed of skepticism in a style that is usually so sincere. Right? The skepticism is something that the poet cannot shake off, despite the poet's very sincere sense of grief and feeling of loss and isolation and abandonment at having to survive in a world while someone is no longer in the world. So what is this seed of skepticism in the last two lines of the stanza? The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. So it contradicts the couplet that ended the previous stanza, in which we were told that the poet became his admirers. And now we are told that the words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. So now that Yeats is no longer alive, no longer has the power to ensure that his words are taken in the right way. His words are at the mercy of those who read them. In a way, this is the fate of every writer. This is the fate of every poet. Words are misinterpreted. In fact, the point of being published, the whole point of being a successful writer is to allow oneself to be misinterpreted, misread, misunderstood. That is the condition of success. And yet, for a writer who has passed away, that universal condition of being successful as a writer appears as a further indignity, as a further twist of the knife. No longer is the poet able to interpret his words, but there is absolutely no control over anyone who might want to misrepresent the poet. But in the importance and noise of tomorrow, when the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floor of the bourse, and the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom, a few thousand will think of this day, as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. What instruments we have agree, the day of his death was a dark, cold day. So this is how the first section ends, and I will stop my reading here, just briefly reflecting on how the last two lines of this fourth stanza reflect the last lines of the first stanza, which is a subtle repetition, and the choice of lines which are repeated convey to the reader the sense that what they're reading is not so different from that of a contemporary of theirs, a friend speaking to them. We return in Auden's colloquial, accessible style to a definition of poetry which was vehemently rejected by T.S. Eliot. The definition of poetry which had to do with a man speaking to men, or which had to do with the expression of emotions recollected in tranquility, both quotes from William Wordsworth from the preface to the lyrical ballads, and which, as we know, Eliot vehemently rejected. We return in Auden towards a conception of poetry, not as a deliberate act of intellectual labor, but rather as the spontaneous overflow of emotions or the recollection of emotions in tranquility. Of course, this is a poet who's very skilled. These are poems written with discipline and rigor and planning and scheduling and very careful attention to each word. But nonetheless, despite all of the labor of writing, they manage to convey to readers a sense of universal human emotions. And the elegy is in some ways the oldest but also the most popular form, because what is more universal than the experience of losing someone we love to death? That is the most universal human experience of all. Everyone who lives must die. And so, as human beings, we must live with grief. We must grieve for those who have died. The fact that Auden wrote some of his best poems as elegies tells us how deeply this poet was connected to other human beings, and how deeply this poet conceived of the poet's task as that of describing in accessible language experiences which were so universal and common. I will stop with that idea and continue reading this poem, but also provide a critical introduction to the history of elegy and describe how Auden changes and complicates that history through some of his most memorable works. Thank you.